Why don't the Chinese revolt against the CCP? It was the middle of April, 1989. Many students had gathered in one of the famous landmarks, in China's capital city of Beijing, the Tiananmen Square. In fact, tens of thousands of students from different colleges came to mourn the deceased reformist Chinese leader, Hu Yaobang, on the day of his funeral. Hu was a reformist leader who believed in providing political freedom to the Chinese people, along with economic reforms that had been ongoing for about a decade then. To understand why the students paid their respect to Hu, you need to rewind a little over a couple of years, to 1986. Encouraged by Hu's reforms, there was a student-led protest in 1986, lasting until January 1987, organized in the cities of Hefei, Shanghai, and Nanjing, demanding political reforms. Many Chinese people didn't enjoy the fruits of the economic improvements, and there was widespread corruption in the one-party system in China, along with high inflation. Who wanted to reduce corruption, enforce transparency and accountability, and have the economic benefits reach the wider population through political reforms. Whose reforms posed an existential threat to many hardline leaders within the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. But Hu was no ordinary leader in the CCP. He had held the top offices of the chairman between 1981 to 1982, and then the highest party post of general secretary since 1982, until leading up to the protest. A large section of the Communist Party leaders hated the idea of freedom of press, freedom of speech, or free expression, though they exist in the Chinese constitution, but only as mere text. To them, such freedom always led to chaos. The student protest of 1986-87 gave a perfect excuse for the hardliners to throw out Hu Yaobang. He was portrayed as someone whose policies may stir up the masses to revolt and destroy the Communist Party. Hu Yaobang was a close aide and ally of the paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. However, when Hu disagreed Deng's orders to remove 3 top reformist leaders, Deng had enough of Hu. Deng finally forced Hu Yaobang to resign as the general secretary in early 1987, but let him stay as a member in the Politburo. 2 years later, Hu died of natural causes on April 15, 1989. He was buried far away from the capital city, but the students in Beijing decided to meet in the famous landmark of Beijing on the day of his funeral. The students wanted to use that occasion to demand for greater freedom of speech and less censorship from their government. The protests garnered widespread support, and in the next few days and weeks, it swelled into a large gathering, reaching as high as 1 million people at one point. The authorities and leaders within the Chinese government were divided how to handle these protests. Zhao Ziyang, the general secretary of the CCP, the one who replaced Hu Yaobang, supported the ideas of reform, and was very sympathetic to the student movement. But Premier Li Peng, and a few party elders, led by Wang Zhen, promoted a violent suppression of the protesters. These leaders convinced Deng Xiaoping and President Yang Sheng-kun to remove Zhao from power. On May 13, many students protesting in the Tiananmen Square went on a hunger strike and were willing to die for their cause. This caused a groundswell of support in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and in almost 400 cities across China. The crisis reached a point that something had to be done to address it. Zhao was pleading with the Chinese top leaders to hold talks with the students and settle the issue peacefully. The hawks outnumbered Zhao and his supporters by a wide margin. They planned to impose martial law to quell the protests, and eventually ousted Zhao from his powerful position of the general secretary of the party. Zhao went to the protest site, interacted with as many student leaders as possible, and gave his famous speech, trying to convince the students to give up on their hunger strike and not risk death. He knew that the government machinery was willing to kill as many as necessary to hold on to power, and wanted to save the youth from a massacre that he knew was about to happen. His speech of May 19, 1989 was received very well at the protest site, though the students were not willing to give up their struggle. Martial law was imposed the next day, on May 20, 1989, and immediately thereafter, the People's Liberation Army was mobilized from Beijing, Tianjin, and other garrisons. More than 30 divisions were mobilized, more than the number involved in the Chinese wars against India, Vietnam, and the Soviets. They moved in with heavy tanks, and according to some estimates, 300,000 army personnel were involved to quell the protests by force. The students at the protest site had been hopeful and confident that their government will not indulge in indiscriminate killing against unarmed peaceful protesters. In the initial days of the protests in April 1989, and leading up to the martial law on May 20th, many of the soldiers, who were around the same age as the protesters, were friendly, and were involved in chats with them. Some of the protesters who escaped the massacre, and sought asylum in the US, later recalled how they would share food and jokes with the soldiers. Due to this atmosphere, despite the presence of such a large force, there was a lot of trust among the students, and they were unaware of the calamity that was about to strike. However, the CCP leaders were clear, and the soldiers had to execute the orders issued to them. Deng Xiaoping and other leaders made elaborate plans on how the operation will be handled. There were many army units that went in, on June 2nd, in plain clothes, to mingle with the protesters covertly, ensuring that nobody carried any weapons, or posed a threat, when the army takes the military action. General Xu Qinshin was assigned for the plan, but he refused to execute innocent civilians. So, the PLA troops, under the command of General Yang Baibing, advanced in such large numbers into the city of Beijing in the morning hours of June 4th. When they reached the protest site, the protesters were aware they stood no chance against the might of the Chinese army. Though many tried to flee, after negotiating with the PLA troops, there was not sufficient time allowed to let everyone leave safely. There were also some who defied the troops, and were willing to face death. The army started killing the protesters mercilessly, including the ones who were in the process of fleeing. In a few hours from the start of the operation, the Tiananmen Square protest site was cleared, leaving several thousand dead, and even a higher number injured. Deng Xiaoping and the other CCP top leaders were not done. They never wanted such a protest gathering to happen ever again, in China. So, they made systemic changes to prevent such a possibility. In the immediate aftermath, the Tiananmen Square, and other large sites, came under high security. The moderates were purged from the party. Zhao Ziyang was branded as the instigator of the Tiananmen protests, and was placed under house arrest until his death. Dozens of CCP reformists were purged from the party, some imprisoned, and some faced even worse. The CCP leaders saw what was happening in the Soviet Union, and the ripple effects in communist-controlled Eastern European nations. The political reforms of Gorbachev to bring in more freedom and democracy was creating an upheaval. It appeared to the CCP that the Soviet communists were losing control, and they knew that the Soviet Union was heading towards a collapse or disintegration. The Chinese leaders employed some strong measures to ensure China does not go the Soviet Union way. The Chinese Communist Party leaders were looking at methods and systems to control the minds of the masses. They concluded in order to ensure that nobody will revolt against the Communist Party, they need to get at least a majority, if not the whole country, be completely convinced that the communist system is the best system in the world, at least for China. They put their propaganda plans to action. The young children, from the age of 5, were asked to recite the communist propaganda every day, through songs and texts. In higher levels of school education, as well as in the colleges and universities, the student bodies were filled with youth CCP members, who were usually the sons and daughters of the local Communist Party leaders. Even today, the head boys and girls along with various office bearers of the student bodies in universities and other educational institutions, are filled with children of the CCP leaders. The student bodies have so much power within the institutes that the student population have to obey them totally. These youth CCP student body members are groomed as future leaders of the CCP. Any sign of opposition or protest is extinguished at the earliest stages. Some of these student body leaders indulge in violence and exhibit dictatorial attitude to make the students fall in line. There is a general fear that is created at every level of their student life. Jiang Zemin, the one who succeeded Deng Xiaoping, brought in more oppressive controls through a large group of law enforcement officers who were involved in internal security of China through surveillance. Xi Jinping took the level of control and monitoring much higher, with sophisticated artificial intelligence tools and cameras, with imported technology from the United States. These AI tools keep a virtual 24-hour survey of every citizen, sometimes even outside China. The Tiananmen Square incident, and the violent suppression, followed by other measures taken by the CCP, has made the Chinese citizens to bear the oppressions and not protest, or risk their life in the process. The focus of the average Chinese citizen has been to earn more and more money, sometimes aimlessly. It's widely believed that money is the god in atheist China since the 1989 protests. That's the reason why there are no large-scale protests in China. Revolts have happened throughout China's history, but in today's environment of such tight controls, it will be difficult to organize the masses, as all social media is monitored and censored immediately. Thanks for watching.